ozone hole since we started measuring. The other two are in 1997 and 2011. By the time this one is done, the scientists think it's going to be the biggest ever.
So you're saying it's not such horrible news because why?
Because since the Montreal Protocol, the Treaty on Ozone-Depleting Chemicals, came into effect in the 1980s, the ozone hole at the South Pole and ozone conditions at the North Pole have very gradually begun to repair themselves. And one of the reasons that we had this massive international agreement that resulted in environmental improvement is that it was supported by two conservative icons in world politics, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher.
Well, conservatives can be conservationists as well.
If they want to be.
Hey, what else do you have for us this week, Peter?
Well, on the EHN page, we have a story from Hillary Beaumont. It's about a pollution problem on the U.S.-Canadian border. The town of Sault Ste. Marie, half in Ontario, half across the river in Michigan. There's a big polluter on the Canadian side, Algoma Steel. There are plans to build what's called a ferrochrome plant to make chromium. On the American side, the waste from these plants has included hexavalent chromium. It's a toxic material that's a known cancer causer. And in this case, it's in an area where there is a cancer cluster. And the company says this plant will be cleaner than other hexavalent chromium sites in the past, but residents are concerned.
Well, that hexavalent chromium is the carcinogen at the center of the Aaron Brockovich movie, right?
Well, you're absolutely right, but here's the thing. There aren't that many major Hollywood releases about the environment, and hexavalent chromium is actually at the center of two of them. Aaron Brockovich and also A Civil Action, a best-selling book that became a hit movie. That one is about a tannery site in Woburn, Massachusetts. There's also an old tannery site at the Sault Ste. Marie Superfund area. And in the Canadian and Michigan location, there are astronomical cancer rates on both sides of the border, including those linked to the steel mill.
So how do folks feel about this?
Well, a lot of folks feel that they've been a sacrifice zone to industry already. There's a lot of mistrust about this new ferrochrome plant coming in. The plant promises to provide 300 jobs if it's built. It's an economically struggling region. A lot of residents are saying they already deal with pollution and cancer. So at what cost are those 300 jobs going to come?
Excellent question to ask. All right, Peter, now's the time that we turn to look back in history, and I'm wondering what you're looking at today.
Yeah, here's something I looked at, and it's really hard to believe this is 30 years ago already. But on April 12th, 1990, Starkist, the tuna company, subsidiary of Heinz Foods, announced that it would no longer buy and sell tuna that's caught by methods that also cause the deaths of thousands of dolphins in purse seine nets.
Yes, the birth of the dolphin-safe tuna.
Yeah, and Starkist was a pioneer. The reason that they were a pioneer is that their executives were swayed by video shot by an activist named Sam Labuddy. He crewed aboard a tuna seiner as a cook, basically another movie title, Sleeping with the Enemy almost, and he videotaped dozens of dolphin carcasses being hauled in with the tuna catch. It appalled people. It turned a corner for this major tuna processor, and Sam Labuddy's courage won him the Goldman Environmental Prize in 1991.
And really struck a blow for using clandestine video, but wouldn't you say this was literally at the risk of his own life?
It was one of the most courageous individual acts of environmental activism in history, and it also taught a lesson about using video.
All right, thank you, Peter. Peter Dykstra is an editor with Environmental Health News. That's ehn.org and dailyclimate.org. We'll talk to you again real soon.
Okay, Steve, thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.
And there's more about these stories on the Living on Earth website at loe.org.
COVID-19 and the climate crisis cannot be separated. I'm Emily Adkin, founder of the Heated newsletter on Substack. The Heated podcast is a 6-episode limited-run series. In this series, we connect the dots on how two of the most pressing issues of our time are really one and the same. I'll bring you up-to-the-minute interviews with climate experts like Mary Hegler, Anthony Rogers-Wright, Kate Aronoff, Aaron Bernstein, and Bill McKibben. Find us in the Drilled podcast feed, everywhere you get your podcasts.
It's Living on Earth. I'm Steve Curwood. April is National Poetry Month, and for some inspiration during these times when we need to stay close to home, we turn now to outdoor educator and poet Susan Edwards Richmond. She teaches at a nature-based preschool west of Boston, and here she is with her poem, One Log Per Visit, Never the Same Log Twice.
So when I'm out with my preschool classes at Drumlin Farm Wildlife Sanctuary, we often talk about guidelines for respectfully entering places where animals live. And there's this one nature play area where there's a lot of big logs arranged in a campfire circle. And in a previous class, we had talked about what might live under these logs, that there were habitats there. So the kids were very excited to start rolling log after log to see what might live underneath. So we sat down and we talked and we came up with some rules for ways to minimize our disturbance of the animals in their homes. 1 log per visit, never the same log twice. In the dark and damp, deep places beneath the surface of our play lurks a lesson in gratification deferred. Shadow creatures, blue as caves and midnight, or red as bloodworms, mudworms meander, spotted with toxicity. Some days, only ants, a spider hiding a sack. Other days, millipedes curl, or centipedes scurry, or ubiquitous sowbugs crawl along bark and roots and offered arms. But the prize awe is the vertebrate who at first glance appears as wet and spineless as a slug, but on second unwinds in graceful curves, spreads tiny frog feet, and paddles the earth.
Susan Edwards Richmond reading her poem, One Log Per Visit, Never the Same Log Twice. Susan is also the author of the children's book, Bird Count. On April 5th, BioBlitz brought together 300-plus participants at a social distance in 27 countries who took photos of plants and animals close to home and used the iNaturalist app to identify and log in those observations for scientists. Living on Earth's Bobby Bascom took part along with her husband Mark and daughters Sage and Luna, aged 5 and 2. They got started at the kitchen window with a view of their bird feeders.
Can you sit next to me in the
Yes.
looking for birdies?
What do we see?
A woodpecker,
How do you know it's a woodpecker?
because it pecks.
I see another animal underneath the other bird feeder. What do you see, Luna?
I think that's a squirrel.
Well, let me get a picture of the squirrel so we can share it on the app.
So cute.
Now I'm going to hit the green share button. Okay, I loaded our picture of the squirrel, and it gives me a few suggestions for what kind of squirrel it could be. But what do you think? Which kind of squirrel do you think it looks like of these pictures here?
Let's see. Put your phone on the window.
Oh, you want to hold it closer? Okay. Now what do you think? Which one does it look like?
That one.
Eastern gray squirrel?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think you're right. Why do you think it looks like that one?
Because it's on the yard.
Yeah, it's in a yard.
And it looks just the same.
Oh, look. What's that one?
I think that's a red bird.
It's a red bird. What kind of birdie is that?
Cardinal. Is it a boy?
Yeah, I think it is a boy. Why do you think it's a boy, Seiji?
Because it's much more prettier.
The boys are much prettier. Are they brighter red?
We have a bunch of species here. I think there's a chickadee up there. There's several, and there's some type of thrush down there. We're not getting pictures of them. It's happening too fast.
I'll go outside and look for more animals.
Okay, that's a great idea.
Yay, let's go!
All right, let's go get our boots on.
I need help getting down. Luna!
From PRX, this is Living on Earth. I'm Steve Curwood. Congresswoman Kathy Castor says responding to the coronavirus may help chart a path for climate solutions.
If anything has given me hope when it comes to climate, it's this massive mobilization across the planet to tackle this pandemic, this coronavirus, and that gives me hope that we will be able to attack the other, more slow-moving crisis, that's the climate crisis.
Also, amid the pandemic, more and more folks with backyards are growing food at home.
Growing this stuff yourself in times like these is highly beneficial for everybody. It's beneficial for the environment, it's beneficial for the planet, it's beneficial for your health, for your mental health, and it's fun. You know, what's to object to? So I think what's old is new again in terms of victory gardens.
That and more this week on Living on Earth. Stick around. From PRX and the Jennifer and Ted Stanley studios of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, this is Living on Earth. I'm Steve Curwood, at a social distance. The novel coronavirus pandemic is turning economies upside down, but so far the U.S. Congress has yet to address structural changes that could enhance the American economy when recovery does eventually begin. The recent $2 trillion CARES Act was aimed at urgent short-term needs, so Congress did not have enough time to include climate solutions as powerful tools for a long-term economic recovery. But as Washington starts to talk infrastructure as a way to put people back to work, there is a team led by congressional Democrats that's aiming to do exactly that. The House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis was about to release its final report when the virus crisis struck, but with this delay, the legislative lane for climate action may get wider. Climate Crisis Committee Chair and Florida Democrat Kathy Castor joins us now. Welcome back to Living on Earth.
Well, hello from Florida. Thank you for having me on.
Now, tell me first, what's the status of your committee? Initially, it was set up by the House leadership, by Nancy Pelosi, as a select committee, which means it doesn't go on forever. And you were supposed to have a report by about this time of year, but of course things have changed, huh?
Yes, unfortunately, we're dealing with the life and death situation, the COVID-19 pandemic. Our Select Committee on the Climate Crisis framework for congressional climate action was actually due out last week. So we were bringing it in for a landing. But if anything has given me hope when it comes to climate, it's this massive mobilization across the planet to tackle this pandemic, this coronavirus. And that gives me hope that we will be able to attack the other, more slow-moving crisis, that's the climate crisis.
At this point, though, the nation is in the midst of this crisis, this pandemic crisis. Why is it a good time to be thinking about climate change policy?
You know, I was born and raised in the state of Florida, and it reminds me of a hurricane. And when a hurricane sweeps through and it destroys your community, it destroys your home, you build back on a stronger foundation. And that's what we have to do going forward. The climate crisis is a public health crisis, and our climate action plan that was going to be released last week and will be released down the road had some very strong recommendations for public health policy and how to keep our families safe and healthy. And then it spanned this entire spectrum. And I think folks will be very interested and focused on those solutions down the road. But first and foremost, it's about helping our neighbors right now and those frontline heroes in hospitals and making sure we get the personal protective equipment to deal with the here and now.
We'll come back to some elements of your report in a bit, but first let me ask you this. How satisfied are you with the $2 trillion CARES Act?
Well, the way you think about the emergency aid package here, the CARES Act, you think about it provided a huge influx of funds for our frontline heroes in hospitals, doctors, nurses, and to develop the masks, the ventilators that we need, and then support for our neighbors and workers through unemployment insurance and direct cash payments. The CARES Act, from a climate action perspective, provides a huge infusion to our transit systems across the country. You know, think about what they're doing right now. They're ensuring that a lot of our frontline healthcare workers can get to the hospital, can get to the clinic to take care of our neighbors. There's also important investments for small businesses, and folks overlook the fact that so many of our clean energy workers and also solar and wind, and this will provide a lifeline for those businesses. You know, jobs in clean energy were far outpacing jobs in oil and gas and dirty fossil fuels, and this should provide a lifeline. I wish we could have done more, though, for those clean energy companies and workers.
Oh, I want to ask you, what about support and the deadline extension for the clean energy tax credits or aviation carbon limits that Democrats had sought in exchange for bailing out the airline industry? I mean, that didn't make it into this most recent package that was passed.
No, but we're going to press to have it included in future packages. And a lot of those provisions related to aviation, yes, we could have done better. And in fact, a lot of the airline companies were in agreement on better aviation fuels and decarbonizing our airports. So I'm confident we'll get there. But the first priority, making sure that those workers and all of those folks that work at airports get the lifeline that they need to make it through the stay-at-home orders.
Now, in terms of jobs and green energy jobs, both the solar folks and the wind folks are saying without the tax credits, they're going to be in trouble. What do you think Democrats are going to do about that?
Well, we've pressed hard, along with a lot of the Democratic senators, to have those provisions included. I think if the Republicans and the administration had pressed forward on a bailout for oil and gas companies or for refilling the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, then the clean energy tax credits would have traveled along with them. So we have an opportunity now to start from a clean slate and to make the case on building that strong foundation for how we want the economy to work in the future. It has to be more sustainable. We've got to be smarter with our public dollar investments. And that means in clean energy, in more resilient communities.
So give us a preview, if you're comfortable with that, of what's going to be in this major report from the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. What are the main goalposts in your report, do you think?
I'm not going to get into too many details on it because this gives us an opportunity to polish it. But clearly we're charting a course for a clean energy future, one that provides an emphasis on what climate means for the health of your kids and your grandkids. I'm excited about the agriculture section because going into this, I didn't anticipate that the agriculture community and our food producers would be so engaged. But, the climate's hurting them desperately. They can't grow the same crops. Their livestock is suffering. There are torrential floods that are flooding out their croplands. So they want to be part of the solution. That means sequestering carbon. That means assistance from USDA and all those great agriculture extension offices, our universities. They want to figure out how they can grow their crops sustainable, how they cover their crops to make them more productive. So I'm excited about that piece. I'm excited about our investment in science and research. I was able to travel to a number of clean energy labs, like the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado, with the committee in a bipartisan way, and solve you get a peek of what the future will be with how we build our buildings with solar, not just solar panels, but solar products that will go alongside buildings of the future. There are innovators that understand that our building materials have to change. That's going to be a source of jobs of the future. Those are a few things I'd highlight, but stay tuned. We're eager to get it out, but the health of the nation comes first, and that's what we're focused on now.
So which of the climate policies that you've studied have proven to be the most controversial or politically difficult as you've been working on your report?
Fortunately, there has been a lot of bipartisan ground that we've covered, but it's still, the kicker still is the carbon pollution reduction that comes from fossil fuels. There are a lot of members of Congress who are tied to the fossil fuel industry. And what will be interesting now as the oil and gas companies are under tremendous pressure because they were overextended financially and their workers are out of work. Do a lot of the members there look for a new and stronger foundation in manufacturing, in the clean energy economy? And those are the kind of bridges we're going to attempt to build in the future.
It's very likely that what we're living in right now is the greatest economic dislocation of our lifetimes. And the unemployment rolls are just exploding along with this virus. What does your Select Committee on the Climate Crisis have to offer in terms of policies that would create green jobs that would help us in the inevitable recovery that we're going to have to stage?
Well, just like the coronavirus, the climate crisis is an unprecedented threat to our public health and safety. But in the end, hopefully it's an opportunity to create those long-lasting, clean energy jobs for a more sustainable future for our kids and our grandkids. And I think these jobs run the gamut. Yes, of course, in clean energy and solar power and wind energy, but also weatherizing our buildings, the way we construct buildings and how we retrofit them, and smart grids and smart meters. Those will be important jobs, very important jobs in modernizing the grid across America, connecting the clean energy sources to a modern grid that will serve our businesses and serve our communities. I think the sky's the limit. And I know folks are feeling very anxious about this pandemic, and I hear it from the folks I represent. But the coronavirus public health emergency we can mobilize the planet. We can attack these enormous problems and health emergencies. And I think this ultimately will give us hope and ambition to tackle the climate crisis. And, in the end, we don't really have a choice. We must do this, and we can do this.
Congresswoman Kathy Castor is chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and represents the 14th District of the state of Florida. Thank you so much, Congresswoman.
Thank you so much.
If you like what you hear on Living on Earth, please join us with a gift of $5 or more. Just go to loe.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And thank you. So it's the time in the broadcast that we turn to Peter Dykstra for a look beyond the headlines. Peter's an editor with Environmental Health News. That's ehn.org and dailyclimate.org. And, of course, Peter, now in this time of coronavirus crisis, we have to have an appropriate social distance for these sessions.
That's right, Steve. And just to be safe, I got out the calculator. This is only an estimate, but I'm just outside Atlanta and you're in New England, right?
Yeah.
So we are roughly 5.2 million feet apart. We're well within compliance for the CDC guidelines.
Indeed. Just don't cough, okay? What do you have for us today?
I'm going to talk a little bit about the Trump administration, coronavirus, and how under the guise of the crisis, they're sneaking in some more destruction of environmental enforcement. There's a gift to the oil industry based on an American Petroleum Institute letter to EPA sent a few weeks ago. They complained that oil companies were being hurt by COVID-19.
Peter, you sound a little cynical today about what the EPA is doing for the oil folks.
Yeah, there's a little room for cynicism here, because 5 days after that memo from the oil industry's lobby group to EPA, the oil industry's wish was granted and then some. The industry sought suspension of its obligations under consent decrees over air and water pollution, over violations at their oil refineries, some waiving of requirements on the handling of wastewater from fracking, and they also wanted to be able to stop for an undetermined amount of time reporting greenhouse gas emissions and other kinds of pollution. EPA also let big oil off the hook for producing the so-called summer blend gasolines that we use each year. They're intended to reduce the risk of summer smog. But wait, there's more. 3 states, West Virginia, South Dakota, and Kentucky, very quietly moved state legislation effectively barring on-site protests against oil and gas pipeline construction. They said that such pipelines are critical infrastructure.
Well, at least these moves aren't bailing out the oil industry.
Well, the stimulus package didn't bail out the oil industry, so the EPA has bailed out the oil industry. There were efforts by some on the Republican side of the aisle to include in that $2 trillion package some help for oil, gas, coal miners. And there were some efforts on the Democratic side for subsidies for clean energy. the end, none of them were included in the bill. So the Trump administration, while the entire country is somewhat justifiably distracted by news coverage of the coronavirus, is quietly slipping in some more gifts to fossil fuels.
All right, Peter, what else do you see out there beyond those headlines?
Not to be outdone, Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, invited a surge in illegal logging by scaling back environmental enforcement. Again, he blamed the coronavirus crisis as a reason to not protect the Amazon.
And how's this going to work?
He said that he was worried that field agents were going to get the coronavirus since they're not in the field, even though Brazil's been criticized for its failure to stop illegal logging. Whatever enforcement is going on is apparently going to stop. That means more loggers will go in. And ironically and tragically, that increases the risk that Amazon natives are going to be contacted with coronavirus, extending the tragedy to the deepest parts of the Amazon.
Let's take a look back in history, Peter, at this moment.
April 3rd, 1980, 40 years ago, what's believed to be the first Senate hearing on the issue of climate change and global warming. It was chaired by the late Senator Paul Tsongas and reported on by the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite, on the CBS Evening News.
The Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee heard warnings today that a coal-burning society may be making things hot for itself.
Researchers say increasingly large amounts of CO2 are accumulating in the atmosphere. They fear the Earth will gradually become warmer, causing as yet uncertain but possibly disruptive changes in the Earth's climate 50 to 70 years from now.
Possible, probable, we really don't know. But if it happens, it means goodbye Miami, goodbye Corpus Christi, goodbye Sacramento, goodbye Boston, which obviously is much more of a concern, goodbye New Orleans, goodbye Charleston, Savannah, and Norfolk. On the positive side, it means that we could enjoy boating at the foot of the Capitol and fishing on the South Lawn.
And who are we listening to here?
That was Uncle Walter, of course, the late reporter Nelson Benton, and the late Senator Tsongas, being very, very prescient and talking about things that we talk about today 40 years ago. That's how much warning we've had on climate change. But apparently, whether it's climate change or coronavirus, we don't always listen to warnings from the experts. One other note on that, young Congressman Al Gore also held the first House of Representatives hearings the following year in 1981.
Thank you, Peter. Peter Dykstra is an editor with Environmental Health News. That's ehn.org and dailyclimate.org. We'll talk to you again real soon, and stay safe.
Okay, you stay safe and healthy too, Steve. Thanks a lot.
And there's more on these stories at the Living on Earth website, loe.org.
If you're looking for fashionable men's basics, you have to try our sponsor, Mack Weldon. When we say basics, we mean that they have socks, shirts, hoodies, underwear, everything you could want, really. We actually bought a few things from Mack Weldon. A shirt for Isaac, and some sweatpants for Anna. She wears them all the time. She wears them around the office, she wears them while hiking. And now, Mack Weldon is rewarding its loyalist customers. They've created the Weldon Blue loyalty program. Just create a free account, place an order for any amount, and you won't have to pay for shipping at level 1. Once you've purchased $200 worth of products, not only can you still receive free shipping, but you'll start saving 20% on every order you make for the next year. And Level 2 will also grant you access to new products before they're released to anyone else. And that sounds pretty good to me. For 20% off your first order, visit MackWeldon.com and enter the promo code LivingOnEarth.
It's Living on Earth. I'm Steve Curwood. A decade ago, Harvard History of Science professor Naomi Oreskes compared climate change denial to tobacco danger denial in her book Merchants of Doubt, penned with Eric Conway and later made into a documentary film. The two then wrote a science fiction novel, The Collapse of Western Civilization, that explored a future when denial about climate science in Western countries kept them from responding to the climate crisis, while an authoritarian China did. Science denial continues today with the novel coronavirus crisis. The U.S. president has often delayed action and failed to heed the warnings of his healthcare science advisors, while China's leadership has taken more timely and successful actions. Professor Oreskes joins us to discuss the role of government and its relation to science in this pandemic. Welcome back to Living on Earth.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
First, before we get into the present moment, why did you write The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future?
We wrote the book for two reasons. The first was that after Merchants of Doubt was published, I got a lot of requests from people saying, would you please explain why people don't accept climate science? And I thought, wow, Eric Conway and I just wrote a 350-page book about that. So obviously we need to find a way to say it again in a different form. So the idea was basically to take that question and to answer it in a different, shorter, and really sort of more fun format. But in addition, Eric and I had been talking for a long time about what we saw as a central irony in the story of Merchants of Doubt. And that was that the people we were studying, the people we refer to as Merchants of Doubt, they were fighting to protect freedom, that they were defending American democracy, American freedom, and individual liberty against the encroachment of big government. But the irony, we believed, was that by delaying action on climate change, they actually made the problem worse, and they increased the odds that the kind of coercive government that they hate would in fact actually come to pass as we had to deal with the unfolding crisis. And so the idea was to write a story that would make that point.
Now, in your view, we've seen China take massive measures for the coronavirus. What is it about China that allows that nation to tackle something like a pandemic so differently from other countries?
Well, I'm not an expert on the history of, but I think one aspect of this is pretty obvious. When you have a large-scale problem like a pandemic that doesn't respect the borders of towns or cities or provinces or states, then you need a centralized response. And a political system that centralizes power is going to be more able to respond to that than one in which power is very distributed. So even though we might dislike centralized power in certain ways, there are certain kinds of problems for which centralized power is really important and may in fact be the only way to address the issue.
Well, President Trump would like to think that he has centralized power in his hands. Why has he been less than effective, at least in the view of many, in dealing with the coronavirus outbreak?
Well, the president personalizes a lot of things, but the reality is that he actually was very unwilling to use the authority that he had. So right when this problem first became identified back in January, he didn't want to empower the CDC or the National Institutes of Health to take a strong response. He also didn't want to use the powers that he had as president of the United States to compel the private sector to manufacture ventilators or to manufacture face masks. Now, 3 months in, he is finally doing that. And suddenly we see the private sector, GM, Ford, are being enlisted to do this sort of work. But the president was extremely reluctant to do that. And I think it stemmed from the basic conservative view or the conservative reluctant to use the power that the federal government has. And so in this case, the consequence of that reluctance is that the virus essentially went out of control, and now tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of Americans will die, Americans whose lives could have been saved if we had acted more quickly and with more organization in the early stages of this disease.
So China was able to tackle the pandemic with very direct measures. What limits these kind of measures in other countries?
Well, I think the really important point to make here is that you don't have to be a communist country to have a organized, coherent response to a challenge. And the clear example of this is South Korea. South Korea is also a democratic country like the United States, but it's a country that has been willing to vest more authority in the centralized government. And it's also a country that acted on the advice of scientific experts early in the problem. Whereas here in the United States, we have a president who has shown his utter disdain for and disrespect for science. He has been disdainful of the scientific evidence regarding climate change. He has been disdainful of the evidence regarding the safety of vaccinations against diseases like measles. And he is hostile to science. He has attempted to cut the budgets in many scientific agencies. He has attempted to prevent scientists from traveling to scientific meetings. And many of us who track science, who study science, who do science, have been warning for a long time that if you undermine scientific agencies in the federal government, that this will have consequences. And now I think we are seeing those consequences in a very, very vivid way.
To what extent is your view that governments can respond to the pandemic without sacrificing democracy or freedom, but they must pay attention to reality, science?
Exactly. I think you just said it as well as I could. Exactly. We don't have to be communists. We don't have to be totalitarians. We don't have to be autocrats. That's the myth that some conservatives have promoted for the last 30 years, that somehow there's no way to solve the problem of climate change without succumbing to totalitarianism. But the experience of South Korea and to some extent Germany as well shows no, it's not about being totalitarian. It's about paying attention to evidence, respecting facts, respecting expertise, and then mobilizing the resources that you have in line with what the expertise is telling you. And the other really important thing that this experience shows, and I think it really validates what Eric Conway and I predicted in the collapse of Western civilization. I mean, look at what's happening now. We've lost huge amounts of freedom. The idea that we were somehow protecting our freedom by disrespecting science, we've now seen how bankrupt that idea is. I mean, I'm stuck at home and so are, 200 million Americans. We've lost tremendous amounts of personal liberty, and we don't know how long this is going to go on. We've also lost income. We're seeing tremendous amounts of damage that could have been avoided if we had been willing to listen to and act upon the advice of experts.
So China and its very much command and control economy, and Germany and South Korea, different countries that you say are able to deal with the coronavirus more effectively because they believe in science. What's the solution for societies to get to governments that will operate on that basis? Because there are many other places that the virus is going crazy, a lot of democratic places.
I think there's two things that we need to do here in the United States. The first is I think we need to rebuild our scientific institutions. And in the process of rebuilding them as institutions, we can also rebuild trust. We've had 30 years in this country of decreasing support for scientific institutions, particularly federal scientific agencies like the CDC, like the U.S. Geological Survey, like NOAA. And in the process of cutting back the budgets for these organizations, we've also seen these organizations subjected to a lot of hostility, a lot of criticism by political forces in Washington, D.C. If we roll the clock back and think about the 1950s when I was born and when money was flowing into science, it wasn't just that the government was putting money into science. It was also that the government was telling us a story about why science mattered. So if you think about Dwight Eisenhower and the early years of the space program, or John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, who carried the space program forward, why did the American people believe in the importance of the Apollo program? It's because we were told a story, a good story, a true story, about how science could help build America, how it could build our economy, how it could help build our educational systems, and how we could do cool things like put men on the moon. So I think we need to recapture that commitment to science and to scientific institutions and to scientists. The other thing, though, that I think is equally important is to rebuild trust in government, because the bashing of science has been linked in a very specific and direct way to a general argument against government, particularly the argument against so-called big government. And this is something that began in the United States under Ronald Reagan, who's admired by many people and was an excellent president in certain ways, but he did something that I consider to have been deeply, deeply damaging. And it's summarized by his slogan is that government's not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. For 40 years, we have heard that argument made by political leaders on the conservative side of the spectrum, so much so that a lot of ordinary people don't understand why we even have a CDC, a Centers for Disease Control, much less why we really need to count on them now in this current moment. And so that's about rebuilding trust in government and governance and making the point that sometimes we actually do need big government. We don't want the government telling us what to do with our lives on a day-to-day basis, but we do want the government to be there for us when we need it. And it won't be there for us. We can't just say, oh, suddenly there's a crisis. Suddenly we have to have government. No, if you want government to be there when you need it, well, it's got to be developed in advance.
To what extent do you think that the anti-government approach by many has led to such a low public opinion, say, of the United States Congress? Sometimes when the polls are done, congressmen and women rank under used car salespeople.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's not a coincidence. If you grow up in an environment in which you're constantly hearing people say government is bad, government is corrupt, government is inefficient, well, chances are you may begin to believe that those things are true. And the irony is that, well, they can become true because then, of course, if you put people in control of government who don't actually believe in governance,
then they're not going to do a good job in building the institutions that we need. And so we have a lot of dysfunction in Washington, D.C. right now. And so people aren't wrong when they see that dysfunction. People correctly perceive that Congress is dysfunctional. But that dysfunction is a product of 40 years of public policies, of essentially anti-government policies.
So, Professor, what's the role of infrastructure in all of this?
One important lesson of the coronavirus pandemic is the role of infrastructure. One of the reasons we've done poorly in dealing with the pandemic in this country is because the infrastructure that we needed to deal with it was not as well developed as it needed to be. So we've seen in the past few weeks how we haven't had enough masks. We haven't had enough ventilators. We haven't had enough personnel available to do the testing. This is all infrastructure. It's the equipment, the organization, the people, the institutions, the buildings that are necessary to address problems. And so this really shows us why you can't simply wait until a crisis is upon you to mobilize the necessary resources. I mean, here's an analogy that I was thinking about just this morning. Almost all Americans accept, whether you're conservative or liberal, you accept the need for an army, you accept the need for the armed forces, because you know that if we were to be attacked, we wouldn't be able to mobilize an army overnight, and we certainly wouldn't be able to build battleships and airplanes and aircraft carriers. We know that we have to do that in advance. We have a notion of readiness when it comes to military matters, but many of us don't have a similar notion of readiness when it comes to public health and medicine. And yet it's exactly the same. If we're not ready in advance, we will not be able to protect ourselves from a viral attack. And similarly, and this is the analogy that then I make to climate change. So if we think about what's coming down the road in climate change, we could be prepared for it. There are a lot of things we could do. One, not to stop climate change entirely, but to lessen it to a very great degree. And two, to be ready to deal with it when it comes. And right now we are doing almost none of those things. So we are very, very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because we're not building the infrastructure now that we need. And the specific infrastructure that I'm most interested in is energy infrastructure. So we could replace fossil fuels with renewable energy. Probably at least 70 to 80% of our energy needs could be met with solar and wind power. But to do it, we need infrastructure, and particularly we need energy storage infrastructure because we have to be able to store the power, for example, at night when the sun doesn't. That technology exists, but it doesn't exist at the scale we need. And right now it's kind of expensive. So we need government research and development to try to bring down the price. If the government were to launch a major infrastructure effort, something along the lines of the Apollo program, I'm confident that within 10 years, we could have an effective energy storage infrastructure that would allow us to use renewable energy as our dominant form of energy in this country. But right now, we're not doing that. And that means that 10 years from now, we may very well be in a climate crisis, not that different from the coronavirus crisis that we're in right now.
So if you were writing a book about these times from the future, maybe a novel like you did before, looking at how China was able to deal with the climate and others weren't, what would be the plot line?
Well, if I knew that, I think I would already be working on it. But I think it would be a happy story about how this crisis became a turning point and how because of this crisis, because these issues became truly matters of life and death in front of our eyes, that the American people began to wake up and they began to realize that there's a reason we have government and there's a reason we have scientific institutions and there's a reason why we spend money preparing for crises that may not happen. Nobody knew for sure that COVID-19 would happen. A lot of people predicted that something like this would happen. And of course, nobody knows absolutely positively for sure exactly how climate change will play out. But we know that climate change will play out and it will be very damaging. And many of the kinds of damage that will occur, we can predict, even if we can't predict exactly when or exactly where. And so my happy ending story would be that this was a wake-up call and that people began to see the need to rebuild our scientific and governmental institutions and to rebuild our faith in expertise and rebuild our faith in so-called big government, but realizing that it's not really that it's big government, it's that it's efficacious government.
Naomi Oreskes is a professor of the history of science for the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. Thank you so much, Professor, for taking the time with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
And stay safe, please.
You too.
Coming up, gardening in the time of coronavirus is just ahead on Living on Earth.
Support for Living on Earth comes from Sailors for the Sea and Oceana, helping boaters race clean, sail green, and protect the seas they love. More information at sailorsforthesea.org.
It's Living on Earth. I'm Steve Kerwood. Well, they say home is where the heart is, and to be safe at home, Trogons take that need to an extreme. Here's Bird Notes' Mary McCann.
When it comes time to nest, birds require a site that protects them both from weather and from predators. Nests are perched high in trees, secreted deep in dense branches, or concealed in cavities. Some birds take a further step, nesting where they are defended by stinging insects. The violaceous trogon of the New World tropics often excavates its dwelling within a large, active wasp's nest. The violaceous trogon is a striking bird, 10 inches tall.
From PRX, this is Living on Earth. I'm Steve Kerwood. Congresswoman Kathy Castor says